To start with, we're just going to go to our files that we've got fresh off the E2. The important thing that we need to have is the fin2 files, .fin2 files. There is a protocol on how to export them, but these are quite key because these will be read in by Iolite, and so the fin2 files will just be named as they are named as .dat files, and really that can be quite confusing when we're importing them in, because if we import them in as they are, we're just going to get these sort of long nonsensical name that's going to be hard for us to reduce that data in Iolite. So what we're going to do first is we're going to label each of these files according to the scan CSV. So on the laser computer, you would have saved a scan CSV file, and all you want to do is just drag it and place it into the folder with all the fin2 files. So then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to copy this and place it onto the desktop. So this is a bit of a needless step. However, it is extremely important for Iolite to access the files because this is an older version. It's easier for the Iolite to access these files if they're not stored on an external hard drive, and that's going to make our life a lot easier when it comes to reducing very large data sets. Fortunately, this is quite a small one. So we've got our folder on the desktop ready to go. The first thing we're going to do is select this fin2 naming files program. This is a Python script written by Untitled Chapter. And all it does is basically it names all of our fin2s according to that scan CSV. So that's really useful for reading those files into Iolite, and will be a lot quicker when it comes to moving things around and manipulating them in Iolite. To run the Python program, there's a how-to doc. You can open that up and it'll give you a sort of basic instruction. But this is a lot of information, and I'll sort of quite succinctly describe it. The first thing we're going to do is open up this .text file. This is what we're going to put our commands into for the Python script to read. And really all you need to do is enter the CSV, the file directory of the scan CSV between these two quotation marks, and the whole label needs to be put in there. And then we're going to put in the E2 folder directory. If we go to our folder again where we stored our E2 data, this is going to be our E2 folder directory. So we can just copy this file directory in, and that will just go in the E2 folder directory. And then you want to just make sure you're labeling the folder in there exactly as well. And so that should just be the folder name here. So this is the folder, and then all this is the same thing, but with the exact scan CSV file put in. So again, copy this link. And then that would just paste in there. And then here we just want to get this, we want to get our complete scan CSV, and then copy that exact link in there. So we have our scan CSV file folder directory in and our E2 folder directory in. So if there's any issue, it's normally with what you've put into in either the file directory or the folder directory. I'm just going to quickly save that again and then run that again. Sorry, basically then we go back into the fin2 file naming program, And now we can just click the, we can just double click the .py Python file. Nothing needs to be done in this step. This is just to show that it's running. Okay, it's finished. That's a good amount of time for it to run. And then in that folder directory, we now have the exact same file called underscore copied. And in it, we have everything nicely labeled. And these are all our fin2s, and they're all labeled according to what spot we labeled them in the scan CSV. So if you scan CSV and your basically, once your scan CSV has a label, it will assign them in order to the file's output by the E2. Now we're going to go into Iolite. So Iolite lives on this bottom bar. It lives down here. It's this little, kind of undulating wave in a little purple square with an eye in the corner. Iolite is hosted by an analytical software known as Igor, at least in this older version. So you needed Igor and Iolite. So Iolite runs as a plugin of Igor, and this is the Igor like host software. But if you click this, will bring you to Iolite. So there's Iolite. Now with this is the sort of first screen, and the first thing that always pops up is, for some reason, is do you want to load the last autosave file? You never really need that, so no. And would you like to remove it? Yes. So this is basically the interface of Iolite. What we have is we have a series of tabs across the. We have a series of tabs in the Iolite window that go from import, baselines, reference materials, samples, the data reduction scheme, and then results, and images if you're doing that, which we rarely do out here. Basically, the idea would be is that we sequentially work from tab to tab, going across as we add our baselines, our reference materials, and then finally our samples before reducing that data, and then seeing the results. These commands up here are largely to do with the Igor Pro software itself. So that's sort of to save or to load data. But this is mostly the Iolite window that we're going to be using. So here we can select our file type. There's a variety of file types, but for the E2 we use the fin2 files. And then what we want to do is we want to select, for the import type, we've got either a single, so that's if you've got a single continuous file, or an entire folder, which we have. And so basically what this will do is it'll read into the folder, it'll look at the timestamp, and it will order these sequentially as a time continuous analysis. So they should all be ordered nicely according to their time, and that's sort of the date format, and that would be the date format. So we hit import. It asks us for the path to the folder, so you can either browse for it or just paste the link in there, which I'm going to do. So I'm going to go back to our folder, which has our copied folder, which has our named fin2 files in it. I'm just going to copy that link, go back to our fin2 files, the path to the folder, paste it in, and then just hit OK. And so what it's doing here is it's reading in all of the standard data and the unknown data that we've collected, and once it's done, so you should have, so I ran 73 scans or 73 spots, and so it has all of the element data that we recorded, and it should be coming up here. If it's read it in correctly, it should have both the element and the mass. So now we've imported it, we can move to check our baselines. So here is what the signal looks like when you sort of stretch it out as a line. So this is currently time on the x-axis. So started the run somewhere at 7 p.m. and ran it till about 11 p.m. And these are all the samples and standards that have run continuously. On the y-axis, we have total beam. A total beam is simply the total counts per second of everything measured. So, for all the masses, they will have it's the counts per second for all of the masses total for each point. So your unknowns will be hugely variable, quite high or quite low, and then your standards end up being, like these ones here, end up being pretty consistent. But what we want to do, and reading as total beam is quite difficult. A far easier way to do that is to read as, say, the uranium, which we're going to be interested in. So we go to select that, which is a much easier way to visualize it. We click channels, and here we have the primary scaling as total beam. And so we want to click that, and we can change it to any of the masses we're interested in. But I'm going to change it to uranium-238 because it's I know quite well the standards and the relative unknowns of what we should be expecting for counts per second for uranium-238. Sorry, just going to do that again. And here's how it comes across. So these really high spiked ones are NIST 610. So that's, as you would expect, it's going to be relatively high doping in uranium. And then we have our standards and unknowns, which are these intermediate peaks or much far lower peaks afterwards. The first thing we want to do now is we're going to select the baseline. So the baseline is basically how the session drifts through time. So realistically, your baseline should be either pretty flat or just slightly decreasing through time. And so by the baseline, what I mean is by the baseline, I just mean those first few seconds where you're starting to record, but the laser hasn't started shooting yet. So we're just selecting that sort of background that is being run to correct off the signal. So how to sort of navigate through this, I'm just going to go back to how it sort of was scaled originally, doing auto. So you navigate through the mouse scroller. So if you scroll in, you sort of elongate the y-axis, and if you scroll out, you minimize it. So here we are changing the scale on the y-axis, and we're making the y-axis quite large, and so our peaks are quite small. And then if we scroll in, we're stretching our y-axis and we're zooming in, and it basically zooms on where you put the mouse. So if you put the mouse high, it'll zoom up towards that point, or zoom out according to that point. And then if you put it low, it zooms according to where you've put that mouse. So that's sort of how you navigate in and out. And then to navigate on the y-axis, you basically you take your cursor down to this lower panel, which has the relative signal heights and signal intensities of all of the analyses. And then if you just scroll in, you can zoom in on each part, and you scroll out, you zoom out on the parts. And then if you zoom in, click, hold, and drag, you can move it across. So that's sort of how you broadly navigate. If you double click, you zoom back out to the whole signal. But if we want to look at like a specific part, let's say we want to look exactly at the baseline, what we do is we create a box. So that's done by just left clicking and dragging, and you drag a box. And so this box here will be basically saying, I would like to look at this area. You release, the box is sort of stuck there. You left click, and you can do either expand, horizontal expand, or vertical expand. So if you expand vertically, you're going to zoom in on that y-axis. If you do horizontal expand, you're going to zoom in on the x-axis, and if you expand, you're just going to go in and look at that particular box. So I'm just going to expand, and I've zoomed in to these boxes, to these signals, and already you can kind of start to see that like the signal is not consistent through time, and if we treated these samples as such, we would be potentially introducing a lot of error to our individual samples. For example, this sample here, we can see that we've sort of hit an inclusion just after we've started analyzing, and so the signal intensity has dropped away, and now if we recorded all of that and treated it as one single sample, that would be extremely misleading. So this is sort of why Iolite is extremely useful. I just wanted to zoom in a little bit more and look at the baselines. And so these are the baselines. So just making another box. These are the baselines that we're going to be using to take the background off the signal. At such an excellent facility like the Arizona Lasercron Center, the backgrounds are usually quite low, but it's an extremely vital step. So I'm just going to double click on this horizontal box, this like bottom figure, and double click on the blue box and expand it out. I'm just going to zoom out so I can view the whole thing. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start collecting them. We're going to start binning the data and generating baselines. So to do that, we need to use an Iolite command that's in Igor. So we go to this top panel here, and in this top panel we go to Iolite. And then what we've got is a bunch of commands here. We can go to the main window, we can do automatic selections, we can see templates for processing, or we can export the data. And we just want to go automatic selections. And so this basically is another way that we can select these individual peaks which have been labeled according to our labeling software. So it's going to ask us what method we would like to define our selection periods, and we want to go. There's a variety of them. Laser log file detects from beam intensity, but we just want to use the information from the input. So we click that, and then we hit continue, and it comes up with a sort of interface of all the individual peaks. And so what they have here is their sample label. So NIST 610. This is the sort of numbers that are output by the E2 after each run, and are a result of how we've named the files. Then we have the time that they were run. So this was run at 1940, and the length that we ran it for, which is 69.2 seconds. So to select the background, we want all of these signals selected. So what we're going to do is click select all, and that has a little tick next to all of them. And then here we have the crop data. Here we have like select integration, which is where do we want to, the selected data, where do we want to bin it? Do we want to put it in as like the standards or the unknowns, or do we want to put it as, like, for example, the baseline? So we do want to in fact put it as the baseline. And then we have the magic that is cropping the data in seconds. Basically, it is how many seconds in from the end of the run and the start of the run are we cropping in? So it allows us to target a specific part of the signal. This crop data aspect is kind of a bit counterintuitive to understand, but really useful for manipulating your data. So I'm just going to quickly take a minute to explain it in Paint. Okay, so I'm just going to draw, the first thing I'm going to do is draw the signal. So if that's our baseline, and then we shoot up, We have a sort of like a varying signal intensity as we go deeper into the grain, and then it drops off, and then we have background again. So this part here is the start. And this part here is the end. So when this command tells us to crop data, it's really telling us that we're basically from seconds from the start, we're going to crop inwards. All right, so we got seconds, this is second 1, and then here we'd have second 2. And so we're sort of cropping inwards from the start. And then from the end, it works in the other direction, but still the same sort of seconds clipping in. So from the end, we're going to go in towards the signal, and this would be second 1, and this would be second 2. So it allows us to really narrow in on the exact part we want, which would be this beam. So we can crop out these seconds here, and we can crop out these seconds here. And that is effectively what we're going to do using the crop command. If our run is 69 seconds long and we just want the baseline, we're going to start at, these guys start at negative 0.5 seconds. I'm just going to start at 1. So I've just cropped off the first second from the start, and then I'm going to crop all the way in from the end. So I'm just going to jump from the end pretty much to the start before the signal's there, which should be somewhere around 61 seconds. So that means we're basically cropping it from, changing to paint, we're basically just cropping it from here all the way to about here. So we're removing this part, and we're just trying to focus on this part here. So you've got your time clip in there, and you've got the baseline that we want to add it to, and then we hit add integrations. So this little spinning seismic ball is sort of like its thinking sign. So if this is spinning, don't be sort of clicking elsewhere, because you're going to like overload this very hard-working piece of software. So once we've had the added the baseline integrations, and you can see these sort of like black little boxes have appeared, we can close this the automatic integrations panel. And then now we can just sort of zoom in and see exactly what we've selected. So again, I'm just going to left click, draw a box, release, left click on the box and hit expand. I'm going to do that again, left click, box, left click, expand. And you can see here that we have, in fact, just selected we've selected just the start, that little, basically that pause before the laser starts firing. And so we have the baseline recording. So double clicking on this little bar here, I'm going to zoom in until I see, which is on the y-axis, until I see the spline, which is going to be basically how the backgrounds have changed over the whole session. And so it's going to be a lot of zooming in, because we really shouldn't see that much variation. And indeed we don't. This is between 0 and 1 to 3 times 10 to the minus 2. So there's very little variation over the course of the run, and that's signified by this green line. So a spline effectively is just an average. We're just averaging the run, and the spline allows us to correct according to how our whole run has gone. So there is instrumental drift. There's always a small amount of instrumental drift over the course of a run, and basically this spline allows us to correct for that instrumental drift. And so there are a variety of ways you can fit the spline according to the data. Automatic just basically puts a smooth spline where it tries to fit the most data the best way possible. And then you've got a series of mean. You can do an average mean. You can do a median. You can just do a linear fit. You can do a linear interpolation, some steps as well, or a series of splines which are increasingly smooth to take out statistical noise. However, the automatic spline typically works the best. You start using a lot of these other splines when your data become a little complicated, when you start to get samples at the start that are really high intensity and then really low intensity at the end, or vice versa. That's when you start to fit these other splines. Typically, automatic does extremely well, particularly for the setup that we have here at the Arizona Lasercron Center, but also for just doing elemental concentrations and individual uranium lead ages. So automatic is just going to be fine. And so now we're going to move to reference material. So the next tab. So here we're seeing basically the same interface again, but this time instead of baseline, here we have a panel of standards. Now, all of these standards are for different matrices that have been added to the standard files that are available in Iolite. So we've added a series of apatite standards, calcite standards, glass standards, monazite standards, rutile standards, titanite standards, and of course zircon standards. And so these are the standards that we will be using, that you would use typically when you came to the Arizona Lasercron Center. And I am reducing apatite for this period of time, but the same thing would work if you're using monazite or looking at titanite. It's the same, as long as you can link these standards to what you've got collected from the E2. So the first thing I like to start with is when I run my apatites, I always run them with NIST 610 because there isn't currently a sufficient matrix matched apatite standard for trace elements. So I'm just going to click that. And so nothing's changed here, but that's because I haven't added anything. There is nothing's been yet added to the NIST 610 bin. So I'm just going to change the beam and change it as I did last time by clicking channels, total beam, and down to uranium-238. I'm going to do the same thing as I did for the baselines, Iolite automatic selections, information from import, and here now I can match the text, case sensitive, so caps lock on, NIST, tab, and it has all the NIST selected, which all have these little ticks next to it. So that's why it's really useful to label things. Label them adequately, because now we can bin them and process them with a lot more ease than sort of clicking through them individually. I'm going to crop the data again. This time I don't want the first 6 seconds. I want the meat. I want that spiky bit. So I'm going to clip the first 9 seconds, and I'm going to clip the last I think it's usually about 11 seconds at the end that it's recorded for. This can be modified by, again, but this is a good place to start. Select my integration, and here I have all my standards. And the one I'm looking for is glass, so G, glass, NIST 610. And I'm going to add that integration. And so we can see that behind, in this panel box behind, all these little boxes have been added precisely over the signal. So if I close this, what we see here is, and I'm just going to zoom in, is we have these boxes just highlighting the precise signal. And I'm just going to zoom in on this guy. And we've got that box over the whole signal. So what we want is we actually want a bit of the warm up, the beam warm up, and we want we don't really need it towards the end. As we go down hole, the data is better resolved at the start and kind of worse resolved towards the end. So you want to be favoring the earlier signal over the later signal. So basically you can start clipping stuff towards the end, but you want to make sure you're getting a little bit of the ramp. And so now you would do this for all of your standards in that same manner. So I'm just going to go through and do the next one. So I'm going to click, and the next standard I think I've got on here is MAD2. Sometimes when you switch between things, the y-axis zeros for some reason. If you just want to get back to where you were, channels, and then scale auto, and it'll bring us back to the regular y-axis. So instead of going Iolite automatic selections, I'm just going to go Control 2, information from import. And so now at this step, I'm actually just going to add all of my standards because I don't actually need to like go out and check them. Now I know that's the time signal that we need to be looking at because all the analyses are the same. They all run for the same length of time. And so we can crop them all the same amount. So match text MAD2. I'm going to crop my data from 9 to 11. And then I'm going to select the MAD2 integration, and I'm just going to add. Now, all I need to do here is actually now I can just add the next one. So let's go McClure, which is another standard. So I'm just going to add that in. So MCC, and then all I'm going to do is just change my integration to add it to. You can see automatically in the background, it's now selected all the McClures. And so I'm going to find that Apatite McClure, and then add that integration. And then I'm going to add Durango. Same thing, Durango, add integration. And lastly, the sort of internal standard that's still in the works for Apatite is MAD6. And then we have a MAD6 bin. So now we've added all our standards, we now can select a spline that we can correct our unknowns according to the standards. We are just effectively, these standards allow us to reference our unknowns according to them, and we're going to create a spline which is going to basically give us the difference to correct our unknowns to these standards. So then the standard I'm going to be using is NIST 610. So glass, NIST 610, here is our selection. And again, there is a variety of ways we can fit our spline. So if I go to like a smooth spline, that's going to fit a straight line, showing the decreasing intensity over time. But again, I just want to use an automatic spline that's pretty much the same and it fits the data quite well. And I've found that through a lot of trial and error that here at the Arizona Laserchron Center that actually the automatic splines are usually the most representative for both uranium lead and trace element data. I get the best results. So now we're going to just go to our samples. So we're just shifting tabs from reference materials to samples. And we're going to do it all over again. So here we're going to go channels, total beam, uranium, and then we're going to select our integration. So I'm just pressing Control 2, information from import, and now we can add all of our standards. All of our unknowns. The time is the same because it's the same signal. So 9 and 11, and now you should have all of these unknowns with their unique modifiers. So I've got KZ1, KZ2, and HP2. KZ1, tab, all of the KZ1 samples are selected, select integration, and now I'm going to add a new integration type. So this allows me to just sort of bin my unknowns according to what I've named them. KZ1. This doesn't even need to happen. It's just a very useful way of allowing us to bin. It allows the software to bin our unknowns, and so when they're exported in their own lovely little bins and files. Going to do the same thing, but for KZ2. So just 2, tab, KZ1, add a new integration type, KZ2, all these KZ2s are selected, and then continue. And now HP2. Under output, there should be all these integrations. KZ1, 9 seconds, 11 seconds. Add integration. KZ2, KZ2, add integrations. So now we should have all of our unknowns, and here I'm just going to click it, and so now we have all of our unknowns labeled. So scrolling in, just going to draw a box around them, and here we have all of our unknowns. KZ1, and then if we change to KZ2, again it's done this y-axis thing, auto. Here's all our KZ2 samples. And then finally we have HP2. Channel, auto, HP2. At this point you can start manipulating your data, start looking at these slopes and these splines and seeing how they correct, or like looking at these individual signals. But what I would really suggest is that we do this in 2 batches. So we're gonna just select everything the first time and process it once, and then we're gonna go back through a second time with everything processed and corrected, and then we're gonna start adjusting according to the signal that we see. So you do it once to transform it from counts per second to ppm using your standards and your unknowns, and then you go back through it a second time looking at the ppm values that have been generated, and you start looking at the spiky signals. And so that's usually the best way, because at the moment all of these slopes should be decreasing because we're sort of going down hole. So we want to basically correct that, flatten them to ppm, and then we can have a good idea about whether we're hitting inclusions or actually erroneous data, or is that due to the signal. I'm going to go to DRS, which is data reduction scheme. So here we have some general settings, which is mean, no outlier reject for the baseline, which is fine, and stats for normal selections, which is a mean with a 3 standard deviation outlier reject. So if you have these selected, you're usually fine. We don't want the software rejecting any of our data erroneously. Here we have data reduction scheme specific settings. Now these are the important ones. So we're going to select a data reduction scheme. So there's a variety of them, from hafnium isotopes to strontium isotopes to uranium lead. For this process, I'm just going to look at trace elements. There is a trace element one, and then there is an X trace element internal standard, IS. We want to use the trace element IS. That's because the trace elements is for when you have a matrix match standard, and the IS is for when you don't, when you need to assume a stoichiometric constant about your unknowns, in this case apatite. And so I'm just going to do that for trace element IS. If you are doing say titanite or zircon and you want the trace elements through Iolite, you're going to have to look at like what your standards are, if they're matrix matched or if they're not, and then you're going to have to look at like what the constant is you normalize to, whether it's like calcium or silica, something like that. So that's user dependent. So I'm just going to do trace element IS. So it's gonna start running a little bit, but that's not actually doing anything. I don't know why it does this. This is just the old version. Okay, so here we are after a lot of strobing, here we are in the data reduction scheme specifics for trace element IS. So for apatite, the index channel we use is calcium 43. The reference material we're going to use is NIS 610, so we're using an internal standard, not a matrix match standard. That's a discussion for another day. The default intensity units that that the fin2 files and the E2 outputs is CPS, counts per second. The standardization method is internal elemental standard. So here we have internal element standard. You can also do semi-quantitative, and that is only if you have a matrix match standard. So you have a matrix match standard, then you can just go to semi-quantitative and you don't have to do much else. But we're going to use internal element standard. The output units we want, there's a series of them, but we want to put them into ppm. The threshold to use when masking a low signal, I just drop that down to like 10 or 1. I don't think it really matters. I think all of our counts are over 1,000 CPS, so we don't really need to worry about that. The seconds to trim before or after low signals, again, doesn't really matter. You're going to be manipulating this data anyway. Table format is normal. LOD method or limit of detection method, normal. The important thing for us is to remember our default index content in sample. What we are using here is the stoichiometric abundance of calcium-43 in apatite, which is 39.74 or 40, depending on what you think. It doesn't really change it that much. From my work, I've found that 39.74 is the abundance that I see most commonly in apatite, and it's also the one that works pretty well for iolite. If you're doing sort of zircon, you would have to do this for silica. Now what we do is with that, we just hit crunch. And now it is actually using those baselines and processing them and then processing those splines to generate our data. So this is just the data generation step. So there's going to be a lot of sort of anomalously high, anomalously low chlorine 35 versus calcium 43 values that are going to be put out, but that's fine. A lot of these errors that it's starting to like pop up with is solely due to the fact that we don't have those elements for those standards specifically. So now we're in this sort of strange middle step, which is the trace element control panel. And basically what this step does is basically you need to match up it allows you to match up the your run to the standards, to the internal standards. So what we're going to do is click export sample name table when this pops up. Select an integration type. It does not matter, but whatever they put up first, hit continue. It's going to go into that folder and it's going to say sample label.txt, and we're just going to want to save that into that folder. And now we're going to open the internal standard data. We're going to select sample labels that we just saved. We're going to open that. And then it's going to basically find the values in those standards. So it basically matches your selections, your standard selections, it matches them to the standards that are in wave metrics. It's or in Iolite. It's a little circular, it feels a little circular. A lot of the nature of this circular stuff is because these of the nature of how this software was built when they first started making it. A lot of these are just sort of like little loops to get through for new programs to be added onto a pre-existing software. I don't know how they've corresponded to the newer version. And so now we have sample label table opened. We have a bunch of values for our standards found, which is good. So our value labels all match up. And now we want to just hit crunch data again. So these errors are going to pop up, but they're not actually errors. We just don't have them. It's just treating all the standards as if they are universal standards that cover uranium, lead, and trace elements. So this is just you're gonna get a bunch of these. So get value from standard. So it was looking for mercury in the NIST 610 standard, but it couldn't find any mercury. That's good. There's no mercury in NIST 610. So these errors are going to come up, but that's mostly to do with the fact that it's looking for things that aren't there, but that's because we don't want them there. So now this is finished. autosave triggered, and we're ready to look at our initial results. So we're just going to click the results tab, and we're going to click the results tab. So summary stats, but basically summary stats, XY plot, stack plot, data table, don't worry about that. Basically what we're going to have here is our runs along the x-axis, and then our values on the y-axis. So this is all, currently the channel is just a corrected, this is currently just like, I think corrected counts per second in a unit, but what we want to do is change that to ppm. So these are our, so this is just like this is the sort of masses that are initially, the values initially put into the files. Then here we have our masses according to counts per second. Here we have our ratios, so our ratios against the internal standard, which is calcium 43. And then here we have what we're interested in, which is our ppm values. So again, I'm just going to jump down to uranium 238 because I have an idea of how much that should be in each of these standards and each of these unknowns. It may have some issues with some of the baselines because it's tried to make a, it's basically tried to get a ppm value for the baseline, but the baselines are so low that it's not been able to, so that's fine. That's a good thing. And basically now we have our standards, so we can just click between these standards and our unknowns and look at their relative uranium concentrations. So NIST 610, we corrected to NIST 610. It has a concentration of 461 ppm of uranium, and hey, we've corrected it to the right one. Madagascar 2, this has about 17 to 20 ppm of uranium, and we're pretty much bang on. Durango has anywhere between 10 and 13, depending on what grain you're hitting. So all of our standards are looking really good for uranium. And then our unknowns, so HP2, these are the parts that we're interested in, our uranium concentration, and so it's a little more variable. That's kind of to be expected because they are absolutely not standards. Normally this this average is corrected to the lowest amount, so it's always going to kind of give you quite a low average, but again, it doesn't matter. The important thing to look for in your standards is to look at how your ppm values change through the run. You should not be observing any clear patterns. If you start to see a pattern like a curve or a decrease, that suggests that your spline isn't fitted correctly. Again, one of these very useful things about Iolite. So with our NIST, we're actually pretty good. We're kind of on at the start. So this average is at 461 ppm, and so we're a bit below it at the start, but we're pretty much on it the whole way through, and we're just getting a little erroneous towards the end of the run, which is fine because you find that you get a little more variation towards the end of runs, at least in my experience with this. Same thing with your unknowns. They should be very variable around. They shouldn't be too much on one side or the other. If they have a distinct shape, that is a spline issue. Now, if all of your samples were perfect, you could just export it here, but we're not going to. We're going to have to go back through our trace element amounts, and we're going to have to correct them according to the individual concentrations. So now we're going to basically go back into our reference materials and our unknowns, and then we're going to re-crunch the data. And we're going to basically modify this by adjusting the boxes around what signal we're measuring. So I've just gone back to reference materials. Now here is everything this is basically how we left it. What you're going to want to do here is you're going to want to select, you can select your sort of reference material you're interested in. We're going to keep it selected on NIST. The channel we're going to want to change though. Instead of uranium-238, we now have all of those lovely ratios and ppm concentrations that we just generated. So I've just clicked on uranium ppm to go to that. And so now here we have, scrolling up, here we have our, basically we have that signal that we collected and corrected for the first time. We now have basically that signal is what we're observing here, and they should all be pretty static. So I'm just going to highlight them, and here we have a series of NISTs, and the box is basically what we're measuring or what we've collected from these data, and the spline, the green line, is the spline that we've used to correct them. And so here at this step, what we're going to do is we're going to be like modifying these boxes and sort of adjusting the signal. And the way to do that is basically shift and then click inside that box. And then suddenly it's sort of red or orange, and you can modify it by dragging it basically inwards. You can only modify it by clipping sample in, and it'll modify the box accordingly. So here we're taking less and less from the end, and we just want that first bit. And so it's made that box kind of short and narrow, or we're dragging it out and it's making it wider because it's collecting more of that signal and it's averaging it. You basically want to make sure your boxes are as large as possible with the most representative signal as possible. The first thing we want to do though is we actually want to clip our signal for all our standards, because our standards are usually pretty well behaved. We want to clip it a little bit more from the start and a little bit more from the end, just so we can get more of this signal and less of this signal, which is sort of towards the end. So I'm just going to go back out to the whole lot. Double click here. Control 2. Information from import. And so now I'm going to do the same thing as I did when we first added it. NIST. And then this time I'm going to clip a little bit more from the start. I'm going to go 11 at the start, and I'm going to go 13 from the end. I'm going to select my integration, NIST 610, add integrations. It's going to ask me if I want to override it. Yes, I do. I'm going to close this box and just view it. Again, it's sort of messed up the y-axis. And so now all of those boxes have been clipped in some way and made them a little narrower. And so now we're preserving a slightly less signal. That on either end, and that's usually a pretty good thing to do to all your standards. So I'm just going to go through and do that to all of ours. So McClure, 11, 13, select integration, McClure, add integration. It's going to ask me if I want to override it. Yes. Add 2. We're going to leave our standards for the minute because they've been pretty well behaved, and we're going to move on and check our unknowns. And now this is the useful part to do. This is the sort of the power of Iolite after all this sort of cumbersome stuff. So here, I've just clicked over to samples, channel, auto. Here I'm going to just select KZ1. I'm just going to do it for one, but you should do it for all of your unknowns. Channels, I'm going to change that to uranium-238, ppm. But now I'm also going to add a couple of extra channels. So for apatite, it's a really good idea to also look at the thorium. And so now there's going to be this green axis just sort of next to it. And basically why we're adding these extra channels is just so we can see if there's any changes in these other elements that we should be concerned about. The other thing I'm also really interested in is zirconium, because if I've hit a zircon inclusion, I'd want to see that spiking up. And so now with these three channels, we can go through and investigate each of our signals. This is going to stay on the uranium box. We're still going to be focused in on uranium. The things will change. We'll see the other ones will change when something is wrong. When something is weird, when we have a lot of thorium or a lot of zircon, you'll start to see spikes. But if everything is sort of relative to one another, which they should be for an individual sample, then we shouldn't see anything wrong. But if suddenly zircon spikes up, you know you've hit an inclusion of zirconium, right? So now we're just going to go through a batch of our unknowns. So I'm going to zoom in on them. And I'm actually going to zoom in quite intently, maybe to look at like 2 at a time. And so basically I want this level of focus on my standards. And then I want, and then I'm going to move by dragging this lower box here. So if using your scroll wheel to zoom in, you can see that we've gone from 20 ppm at the start to 10 ppm at the base. Now, you're going to have to decide whether you think that's a meaningful thing or issue, or if it's just sort of error. And then you're going to have to, you can either just delete that, get rid of it entirely, or you can move the box by pressing shift, clicking into that box so it's illuminated. You can drag it so we just get, let's say the 10 ppm aspect, or perhaps you're like, no, I really think it's more like 18 ppm, and you just get that start. But that is sort of the user control and the user power. So I'm just gonna go and grab that lower box, for example, and so that will be a little bit lower. Here at this point, you kind of want to be taking notes on what you're doing to each of your samples, particularly if you are really needing a precise constraint on uranium concentration or any elemental concentration. You'd want to be like, this spot, I selected the lower spike, you know? And so then if your age turns out weird, if your uranium concentration turns out strange and erroneous, you have a reason to exclude it. You're not just sort of being like, well, that must be geologically meaningful. This is a normal one. This is about the regular amount of variation we should see. What you could do is clip it in a little bit from the start and a little bit from the end. Maybe just grab that. It's not changing anything hugely. In fact, it's probably just making it a little bit more variable, but more reflective of the signal you've actually measured. And we're going to go through and just do that for all of these unknowns. So here, this spike here, it is the inverted ramp of the start of your analysis. So you want to clip that away because it's just this, it's basically the start of your signal, but it's been interpreted to be a period of quite high measurement. But that's just sort of the, that's from nature of what we selected initially. And so I'm just going to drag that in a little bit, but that's looking good. This is also fine. So, you know, if they're quite low, so the thing is like you can sort of, these can look quite variable, but actually on your y-axis they're not. This will be the mean. It'll put out the mean of this box, and this would be your error. So, you know, even if you're quite zoomed in, so even if it looks quite jagged, it's actually, once you're sort of zooming out, it's actually quite a well-resolved a line. Dragging across, so here are my standards, back into my unknowns. Again, just shift and click to highlight the box. And so for this one, I'm just going to take, when it starts to drop off, I'm just going to take that and just say that that is a representative. Again, you should be marking this down and making a note of it in case you need to exclude it or something comes up later on. Here, I'm just going to get rid of that front bit. It doesn't change the mean hugely, as here it was probably about 24, and then I've changed it down to maybe like 23.5. But we just want to make sure we're clipping some of these like little erroneous bits, like the signal dropping off at the end and the spike at the start. The other thing that I'm going to show you that's really cool about Iolite, I was trying to find a sample in this session, but they've all been pretty well behaved, is you can clip around poor signal. If you have like an inclusion or a spike in your signal, let's say a chunk of extremely high uranium surrounded by two areas of quite low uranium, you can actually clip around that. So what to do there, let's say for this, I want this start bit and I want this end bit, but I don't want this middle bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this box, drag it to make a small box around one area of interest, and then I'm going to press Control and then click and drag, and it's going to create a new box. All right? And so now we have this box, now we have two boxes here, and if I have this box selected and I hold my mouse over this box, the link button comes up. And if I click that link button, it will create this orange averaged box from these two. And this is going to be orange in your output as well, so you'll know which one you've modified to avoid some signal. This is really only something you should be doing if you're like really desperate for like a bit of data. I would really recommend, if you've got an extremely large spike, just kind of clipping that out altogether, like just deleting that sample. And then back here again, I'm just going to select it, shift and click, and I'm just going to clip in this signal. So that's really all you do when you're sort of like modifying it. You're just individually checking each of these signals and adjusting the box to the exact area that you want. When you're happy with all of it, so I'm going to say that we're happy now, all you need to do now is just go to the DRS, so you can just click the data reduction scheme. All of those settings should be the same from when we were last there. And then all we need to do is just hit crunch data. And so this is going to do the same thing again, but this time it shouldn't need the export table. It should already have that export table loaded, and then it should read that in and go straight to the results. The trace element control panels come up, but it's not needed to read anything, so that's just fine. And now we're finished, and we can just go to our results. And here we're already in our results panel, and this time there should be a small amount of variation around our standards. So these have sort of changed somewhat because we've just clipped and we're recording a little less signal. And then our standards, our unknowns are going to be clipped according to how we modified them. And so there'll be a small amount of variation on your uranium concentration here, but or your elemental concentration here, but it won't be a major shift. One of the things I'd like to point out is that sample that we made a little two separate boxes and joined them. Yeah. We just want to export it in the rawest format, where we just sort of basically output everything that we've reduced. And so the way to do that is Iolite, this Iolite button here, and then export data. So you name it, test data apatite, and then you hit continue, and it's going to save this to wherever you read your data from. So in our case, from the folder that we read our copied fin2 values from. And so that's where it comes up here. We can change our folder where we export it to, but I'm just going to export it to precisely where we read our samples from. And that's it. If you want to save your data, you can go File, Save As, and then it'll save it as a PXP file. And yeah, at this point we can just close. As long as that has that saved, you can just reopen that file and it'll take you back to these sort of panels and you can modify the data. And you should have an export that will look something like this. It'll be test data, Apatite, all integrations. It saves as a text file. You can just open it as a text file. This will read really well. This reads really well into Excel. You've got your elements up the top in ppm, so ppm value of vanadium and our vanadium error of 2 standard error. So make sure you remember that it's 2 standard error that everything comes out of. So if you're putting it into a different data plotter, just be aware that your error is doubled. And then here are your concentrations for all the value, for all the standards, and they should be separated according to what you've bin them as. So in our case, you know, KZ2 is just put in here, and then here we have NIS. So everything there to read and interpret as you wish.